Welcome to AI for Good, the leading action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by ITU, in partnership with 40 UN sister organizations, and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. In today's session, we're counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished panelists and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Yeah, welcome to the Trustworthy AI webinar series. My name is Wojciech Samek from TU Berlin and Fraunhofer HHI in Berlin. And it's a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Sebastian Lapuschkin. Sebastian is one of my closest collaborators. He is a real pioneer in the field of explainable AI. He is a computer scientist by background and finished his PhD with distinction from the Berlin Institute of Technology in 2018. He is recipient of multiple awards for his work on explainable AI, including the Hugo Geiger Prize for Outstanding Doctoral Achievements and the 2020 Pattern Recognition Best Paper Award. So, Sebastian, I would welcome you, and the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thanks for having me, and thank you for the nice introduction. I'm going to start by sharing my screen as it is custom. Today I'm going to talk about the next level of explainability or explainable AI. Maybe some additional words about myself in the beginning. So I'm active in the field of explainable AI research for close to a decade now, actually a little bit longer than a decade. And I've spent most of my time developing methods which help us as users and developers to understand machine learning models and AI predictors. This talk is going to be about, so I'm going to open with a short intro about machine learning and AI. Then I will go towards the necessity and the tools we have for using XAI 1.0, basically traditional heat mapping based explanation methods, and which are local explainers, which means per data point and prediction we get an explanation. What are their applications and in what way are they limited? And then we go quickly towards global explainability to then move on to the main topic of this talk, which is a recent advancement of explainability originating from our lab at Fraunhofer HHI, which combines local and global ideas for explaining machine learning predictions to obtain more human understandable explanations. So in the last years, in the last decade, we could observe a rapid trend in machine learning development, and we were observing basically strong results obtained by those methods. For example, you might have heard from AlphaFold, a machine learning model which has basically broken through the boundary of protein structure prediction, which was considered to be an unsolvable problem for a long time, or AlphaGo, which was able to basically outperform the world's best Go players by developing novel strategies which have not been used by any human before. But on the other end of the spectrum, we are still dealing with machine learning models which are performing near catastrophic level. And by that I mean they are exhibiting clever Hans-like behavior, which means in turn they tend to perform well in terms of accuracy scores in the lab or in test settings on test data sets, but they fail miserably when deployed to the real world. And the question is now, why is that, and what can we do about that? One of the reasons why machine learning models tend to misbehave at times is that they are, for one, data-driven, which is in essence a good thing, because we can provide lots of example data to the machine learning models in order to train them to solve a particularly difficult to express problem when you think about programming it expressively with, for example, I don't know, rule-based systems and so on. So hard-crafted rule-based systems. I mean by that. However, one problem is that data rarely is perfect, and in the recent past, we've seen numerous examples of where training data used in machine learning benchmark settings is flawed in some way or another. And two examples here from the long list of potential flaws constitute unwanted correlations in the data, for example, where the model is trained to pick up or learn a connection between a set of examples and a desired outcome. Which again works well on the test set, but we cannot be sure whether it's really concentrating on the key aspect in this data, for example. Another problem is mislabeled data or imprecisely labeled data. For example, the right images are from the ImageNet dataset, which is widely used to run benchmarks, train models, etc. And here we see that, for example, the top left example image with which shows oranges is labeled as lemon. And while both answers are true, the model is trained to only predict lemon and is only assessed to predict lemon. So there's a certain upper bound on the performance we can get and measure in this case. So given knowledge about the imperfections of the data we have, how can we be sure that the models we train and employ are actually using the information it should use and that they are behaving in the way which is expected and safe and trustable in a way? In these examples, for example, we see 4 images, all of which are predicted correctly as classes boat and horse, but we cannot be sure whether the prediction is based on contextual stimuli in the data points or due to some completely unrelated reasons, or whether the model is actually using or recognizing the complex objects it is intended to recognize in the first place. To alleviate the problem of this black box nature of modern machine learning models, the field of local XAI or XAI, explainable AI in general, has emerged over the last years. And countless methods have been proposed, many of which compute explanations in the form of visualizable heat maps, like you can see in the bottom left of the image. The typical procedure is that you have your model which has been trained to solve a task, you get a new input, you predict the input, and given the outcome of the model, you can then try to infer a prediction, which comes in the form of you can infer a explanation, which comes usually in the form of a visualizable heat map, which allows then us as a human observer, in this case, to interpret what the model might have been using in terms of information in the input in order to make its decision. And we typically read it like this. We have, in this color scheme, we have black color, which means a lot of black color, which means that those are input stimuli, here pixels, which haven't had any impact on the prediction making because they received low attribution scores. We have hot colors from red to yellow, which indicate that this information was used heavily by the model in order to make the prediction rooster. And we have also some blue parts of the image, which tell us that these might have some, I don't know, contradictory evidence to the prediction we have currently tried to explain. And now we need to interpret this, and my interpretation is can be read in the bottom right. And I think that the model is using the throat wattles of the rooster in order to recognize the whole animal mostly. And it's also using the featherwork a little bit to make this prediction. And this helps us essentially to understand what the models are doing and what kind of information they have used or learned to use in order to make their complex predictions. In these examples, those are the images from 2 slides before. We see that the models all misbehave because while the predictions they make are correct, they are the model is predicting boats and horses, the reasons for those predictions are inherently wrong because in the top left, for example, the model solely infers the presence of a boat based on the presence of water in the bottom third of the image and discounts the boat information itself. Here, the color scheme is a bit different. Here, green is the neutral color, and in the positive spectrum, we go from red to yellow again. No, yellow from red in this case, actually. And the negative part of the spectrum goes from cyan to deep blue. And this essentially means here the water is the important factor in order to recognize a boat. And would this boat, for example, not be in water, the model wouldn't have any chance in order to predict it correctly. Another example is at the top, the bottom images, where we see that the model is focusing mostly on a copyright watermark, which is correlating with the data with about 25% of the horse class images being polluted with this copyright tag, because the data has been collected from the internet and used in computer vision challenges for 10 years now, without anyone really knowing about this flaw. So we basically, in this scenario, understood that the models have been assessed for copyright understanding rather than horse understanding. These results are particularly well readable because the important information is well localized, the important information used by the model. However, this is rarely the case in reality, and often not even necessary in order to make good use of explainability feedback. So how does it work? How can we obtain such kinds of interpretable feedback for machine learning predictions? There are many ways to compute heat map-like or heat map visualizable explanations. Three prominent approaches are, for example, building surrogate models, which accept the model as a black box and then try to fit an explainable model in input space, or probe the input space and observe the model's output reaction, for example, by masking single pixels and then measuring the effect to the output function of the model in order to assess the importance of single pixels or subregions. Another way is to build inherently explainable models by keeping the flow of information separate, for example, disjoining the complete input image into separate sub-images, which get fed into the model individually and then are then still combined at a later stage, for example, when the model is joined or functioning as a linear predictor, which makes it more interpretable as, for example, say a deep network. The methods we are currently focusing on are backpropagation-based methods, which can be used on a wide range of models of various architectures, many of which are based on the backpropagation of radiant flows. What we use in our lab and what we have developed in 2015 is the layer-wise relevance propagation, which in a nutshell decomposes the prediction made by a model. And one basic assumption is that if we have some machine learning model which can be written as a directed graph, which receives information in the input end. For example, here we have a model which has been trained to predict the gender of an image of a face. It receives the pixel values in one end of the model, in the input end, and then computes mappings towards the next representation stage or layer in this case. And we have a flow of mappings through the model. And with those mappings, a lot of activated neurons or nodes in this network might occur, many of which do not really reach the end, or of which the activations never reach the end. And once we have the prediction, in this case, class female is the output, we can then decompose this prediction making by first assuming that for each node in this network, we have a so-called relevance score, which tells us how important was this neuron for the final outcome of class female. And initially, this is given by just feeding in the output of the actual output neuron for class female in this case. And then we distribute this importance scores across all its inputs, all its neurons inputs, according to those inputs' contributions to the activation of this output. And we can work our way through this layer by layer from the output of the model to the input until all the nodes in the network are covered and basically have their importance contribution score until we reach the input. And then we can basically, again, visualize the basis of the decision making and see that the assessment that this face might be from a female person is stemming from the eyes and the hair in this case, and the beard, however, contradicts it. So we have negative evidence marked in the heat map, and from that we can read that there are some parts of the image which help the model predict class females, but there are other parts of the image, for example, which contradict the prediction of female because they might contain typically male information as presented in the data. Okay, I'm waiting for the next slide. Seems to be frozen. Ah, there it is. Okay. All right. So one thing I already hinted at was that we have a marking of the input space in this case, which allow us to interpret what kind of information or what particular information the model has been used in order to make the final prediction. And this works because we usually, if we use explainability methods, contextualize the explanation. Contextualization in this case is that we don't just explain the whole model output and backpropagate everything, or while we use occlusion-based methods and change stuff in the input space, we don't observe all the network outputs. We usually observe one particular output representing one class, for example. And this gives the explanation some context. And here again, in the figure, you see the output, also first to the left an input for a handwritten digit recognition model. And to the right, you see the explanations given by relevance propagation for all individual output classes predicted by the model given this particular input. And what we can here see, for example, if you look at class 3, is that there are parts of the digit which correspond to the 3-ness of the 8, which is marked by red. However, there are also some parts which strongly disagree with the 3-ness of the digit 8, and those are the parts to the left where a 3 would be open. There wouldn't be closed arcs, right? So we can see and interpret in context of a particular prediction that the model uses how the model uses the input information in order to make it an assessment. And if you would not do this, we would get something like on the second panel to the left, where we have all written on top of it, which is explaining all outcomes at the same time, and which would result in a rather unspecific map of some importance, right, without any task attached to it. So while we still, okay, right. So I used the term cognitive optimization or contextualization for cognitive optimization. What I essentially use this term for is, or I borrowed it from a recent paper from Hacker and Passot, which embed the goals of explainability in the frameworks of the AI Act of the European Union or the GDPR. And basically, they create two axes for the goals of, or among those goals, they create two axes for the goals of explainability. One is cognitive optimization, which in a nutshell means that information from explainability must be presented in a human processable way, so it is easy to digest and useful in the end for the stakeholder. And the other axis is goal orientation, which means we want it in some cases do something with this information, and some of those goals we might want to achieve do not require a precise understanding of the explanations we are given by certain XAI methods. Now, if we go back to this example where we talked about a contextualization of explanations in order for human consumption and cognitive optimization, the results with boats and the horses and the MNIST digits are quite easy to understand because the explanations themselves are not that very complex. However, if you think about other settings, typical in machine learning, for example, in ornithology, where we might train a model in order to distinguish between 20 different bird species, the model works quite well. But if we then explain it again, even if we only explain single outcomes, so we compute contextual explanations, we get something like this here. For example, in all those cases, the prediction has been correct, and in all those cases, the explanatory heat map, which we need to interpret as a human then, would mark the whole bird as a result. If I were to interpret this, I would see that the model is basically using the whole bird for making the prediction, which is fine in one hand, because I know it's not reliant on context or image context. But on the other hand, if I would want to know what in particular the model is using about the bird, I won't get any additional information. So this explanation, in a sense, is kind of useless for me. How is that? I mean, this is a common problem if you have settings in especially computer vision or machine learning where we are not dealing with object categorization. So actually, in many settings, we have kind of this problem that we have heat maps marking stuff in input space, which is somehow superimposed. The explanation is superimposed from different factors going on internally in the model. And this affects not only backpropagation-based methods, where we have, for example, some encodings in later space or in deeper layers, which are used in order by the model to make a prediction, and then in turn in the explanation might be read by the model. So during inference, it might be read from the same input areas. And as a result, if we explain this again, a lot of the explanation scores end up in the same image areas again, which means we have an effect of superposition of feature attributions, hindering us from clearly reading what the explanation is about. However, like I teased before, there are many applications in XAI currently being published and under review, which use explainability in latent space with high efficiency without the need to actually understand what the explanation scores mean. Two example applications are the use of explainability scores, which mark also internal parts of the model while working basically their way through the model from the output space to the input, in order to differentiate what parts of the model have actually played a role in decision making for one particular inference, and which parts have laid idle. And combined with the assumption that typical machine learning models are highly over-parameterized, which means a lot of the parameters are after training not even in use, we can use this insight to extract slimmer models, more efficient models by, for example, stripping away 90% of the parameters which are identified as useless and they just consume energy. In another line of work, the same basic idea is used of identifying the functional core of the model and removing, and isolating the functional part by using the remaining free capacity we have identified as useless via explainability feedback in order to learn additional tasks into the model, concentrating the learning efforts on the non-functional parts in order to provide prevent catastrophic forgetting. Catastrophic forgetting in this context is basically a typical thing happening in machine learning when we fine-tune a deep neural network, that strategies learned on a previously trained on data set might be overwritten by a later training task because we might not have access to the exact training examples of the previous data set. And which means the model forgets things over time. And when we use explainability information in order to mark those latent parts of the model without actually knowing what they mean and what they constitute, we can freeze this information and prevent this effect. Another line of explainability work focuses on the cognitive optimization of local XAI, which again works by marking parts of the network or the input space according to their importance to decision making. Some works try to increase the understandability of the explanations by purpose-building models, which are more interpretable because their latent representations are less abstract and they have reserved meanings. For example, to the left, the paper of Kriegman et al., which works in epidemiology and is used for the detection of sufficient causes for disease identification. Or on the right, we have some works, some of which I co-authored, which collect thousands of heat map-based explanations in latent space or input space, and then process these, for example, with clustering algorithms in order to identify and understand in general prediction strategies and feature use strategies developed by the model during training, which can then be used in order to develop countermeasures and, for example, for fixing model behavior in the case of the horses, for example, which have been using copyright watermarks in order to predict the horse themselves. We can find the strategy, we can model the strategy in the input space where it manifests in the model, and then we can develop counter strategies, for example, for specifically unlearning the copyright watermarks to force the model to use other features of the input images in order to understand horses, or to suppress this information, for example. So here we have a example of for when we increase the cognitive optimization, the understandability, in order to do something with it by the model, because we as humans decide that it's misbehaving in a certain way. Yeah, so right now I talked a lot about local explanations, how they mark input features or latent features about respectively to their importance for decision making, without us really knowing what they mean. And in contrast to this, there's the field of global XAI, which is focused on trying to understand the general encodings learned by the model. And there are different approaches to do this. There are, for example, the field of generative global XAI, which tries to, for particular input, and not input, but latent encodings and hidden features, for example, generate input representations or representations in input space, which capture the essence of whatever concept has been learned in latent space. This is rather non-trivial, which is shown by a long line of work working in this direction, just concerned with making the outcome human interpretable, because a lot of the time it's quite noisy and kind of psychedelic looking. Other branches are basically visualizing the features or trying to visualize the feature extractors themselves, or they go about by using densely labeled data sets, where for each image, for example, in the image classification task, information is given per pixel, what kind of object is in this pixel, what kind of material is this, etc., blah, blah. So a lot of densely labeled information specific to one data set, and one can use this information then in order to measure the neuron responses in latent layers of the neural network, in order to find out what functions are implemented by those, or at least for what categories those neurons fire, right? More recently, there's a line of work using a database approach in order to understand the Chen et al. Paper, to understand what the meaning of the encoding of latent neural networks. And it basically goes about by scanning a reference data set, and then for each neuron in the network, ranking the processed input images, and then looking at the top K ranked images in order to understand, or ranked by activation in order to understand which ones stimulate those neurons the most. In our recent paper, we published or uploaded an archive this year, 3 months ago, 4 months ago by now. We aim to combine both the directions of local explanations, basically, which give us per prediction the model makes a interpretable feedback, and the global XAI approach, which assigns a set of meaning or representations to each part of the network, which works in a static way, in order to get some global actually. Global is a combination of local and global way of explaining these models, which allow us not only to explain with heat maps which need to be interpreted by the human, but are available for each individual data point we want to have a prediction for, but we augment that basically with example-based explanations, which allow us to understand the semantics between the encodings used by the model. While there are several works out there right now and being developed, and while this approach is quite fresh, what sets our method apart is that it's completely post-hoc, which means we don't have any extra requirements on the training data. It delivers global information, is highly computationally effective and efficient. And what did I forget? No, basically you have no assumptions, right? You can just download your model or train your own model and then plug it into this explainer based on CRP and relevance maximization. I will get into detail about this in a second. And then you have it. You have your context-based, example-based, local global explanations. And we want to use it, or are currently using it, as a stepping stone from basically increasing human digestibility of explanations for going towards interesting applications for human-computer interactions, for example, using those insights to really do something with the model, infer information about data sets, find flaws, discover knowledge, etc. So you remember the slide from a couple of minutes ago where I've shown this backward flow of attributions and talked about one of the problems that heat maps are often difficult to interpret is that many of the latent representations which are co-explained during this backward process are not properly represented in the explanation space because their feedback is overlapping in the pixel space, for example, or in some tabular data. And Let's assume the following, and this assumption is basically supported by also the a wide variety of global XAI research, and which tells us that during training of an end-to-end deep neural network, for example, latent encodings and representations in some hidden layers often constitute human interpretable concepts. And if you think about this example again and look at this blue neuron and this yellow neuron, and we understand this model as a predictor in context of bird classification, for example, this blue neuron might have learned the task to pick up a particular type of beak, which is important for understanding or distinguishing between different bird species. This yellow neuron, however, picks up different types of plumage, which are important for the same thing, the same task, but it's encoding a different thing. If you now would go backwards or backpropagate through the model, we would have an effect that sometimes those feedbacks, for example, the explanation scores traveling through the beak neurons and the explanations traveling through the plumage type neurons, they overlap at some point and then they end up clumped up in pixel space and we cannot really recognize anymore what in this important area has been so important. So we can answer the where questions, kind of, but we have no way to answering the what questions because the what questions can only be answered in latent space by assigning concepts to hidden neurons. So what we did in this work, I'm talking right now, is that we started respecting the concurrency going on in deep neural network prediction making. And concurrency, basically, the simultaneous recognition of different objects and concepts and abstractions we understand as human, but also which are present in the deep neural networks because they are with the hundreds of neurons existing at the same time, at the same level in the neuron, co-recognized, so to speak. And we did something quite simple, but effective. We added a masking procedure to the backpropagation flow, which is based on the following assumption, which partly can be fulfilled later or is to be fulfilled, let's say to 95%. First assumption is at this moment, we know which neurons and filters have been important for prediction making. And the second assumption, which is more difficult to fulfill, is that we know the meaning of those filters. Let's assume in this case, we have a model which is predicting, 1 million different object and animal categories. And this input image is put in, the model puts out dog. If you would only explain the dog, for example, we would get this kind of heat map. Which hides a lot of information from us. For example, how important is the dog's face? Is the complete snout important? Is it only the tip of the nose? Or how important is the fur, etc.? So this kind of stuff cannot be answered by single heat map explanations. What we can do now with our masking-based approaches is we can select, for example, concepts of interest, which have played a role in prediction making. For example, let's say we start with snout. We can now explain the dog given the use of the concept snout, and then explain this as a heat map in input space, which concentrates nicely on the snout-like features. This allows us to disentangle the explanation process, similarly to the entanglement of the prediction process in the forward pass. And we can end up with multiple different explanations. For example, for the dog recognition using concept of snout, or the dog recognition concept using the concept of eye, and the same thing for fur. And what we see is that the explanations get a different quality from what they have had before. For example, now the fur concept is popping up way more because previously it has been relatively compressed because the eye concept is important. The eye's concepts importance scores we got by explaining are concentrated on a smaller image area, which result in a per pixel higher amplitude, which then leads to a stronger expression in the color space of the color mapping we use to visualize this information. And this completely hides what we can measure now in input space if we can disentangle the strategies respective the use of particular features. And that is, in this case, that fur actually is the most important features for the recognition of this dog. Now I talked about a lot about selecting interesting concepts, and framing this as an assumption that we must make. But actually, this is not true because if we backpropagate through the model, we can just mark in a single layer, for example, with the explanation scores, all the encodings which there are on neurons, and then we can use this information in order to come up with a ranking with the most influential encodings or filters or concepts. And this gives us, for example, in this case, the top three encodings for recognition as class dog, which are snout, eye, and fur. So this can be automated away. So what remains to understand is the meaning of those, or what remains to get at is to understand the meaning of those latent encodings, which will be solved in a minute. But given the simple masking approach of CRP, Concept Relevance Propagation, which just masks and restricts the backflow of explanation scores, gives us a set of handy and interesting new tools. For example, with that we can locally in the image assess where certain concepts have been recognized by the model. For example, in this area is there only fur, in another area there might be the dog's face, and we can use it to obtain some interesting results presented later on in the paper, or with an appropriate aggregation strategy of all the messages, explanation messages flowing back through the model during the explanation process, we can understand how more abstract concepts in higher layers are depending on the expression of less abstract concepts like texture and color features, for example, in lower space, and or how in general, how extremely abstract features near the output are made up as compound features of less expressed, less abstract encodings in lower layers. So in a nutshell, CRP helps us by disentangling single explanations into multiple contextualized explanations, not only contextualized to a class, but also to the use of particular concepts and input space in order to refine the what question. For example, here for this lizard, we see that there might be some lizardy features which are important or defining for recognizing the lizard class, actually 1, 2, 3 almost purely lizard features, but we also understand that in this ranking of most important features encoded by some inner parts of the network, we see that apparently there's a lot of stuff going on in the background. The model is using a lot of context, but we don't have a clear answer, right? We still need to interpret the seed map. So what about the what question? This is something which urgently needs to be answered in order to fully understand the reasoning of the model. And you remember this one? This is where the global explainability again comes in, which can be neatly combined with the local approach in order to provide the semantics and those meanings about what those encodings actually mean in a human understandable way. So in literature, what's typically done, if you look at this one, again, particularly the bottom right quadrant, people try to build rankings of data samples or all samples of whole data sets for individual filters and feature extractors in the models in order to get basically the top K most representative representations in the data set corresponding to this particular hidden filter the model has learned on its own during training. All of those methods are basically, they are based on the activation or the stimulation of those hidden neurons, which means how on is this thing if you pipe in this data point, right? We argue, however, that going by activation or maximizing activation in order to find the most representative examples is not a good way and is not the sole best answer. And the reasoning is simple. If you think about what's going on during the measurement of stimulation, is the following, right? We provide the model with an input data point on its input receiving end, and then this input is transported through the network and transformations are computed. And at some point of interest we're currently looking at, we measure the response of the model to this input stimulus, which means we are at the gray panel here, right? And what's missing is the connection. If you go by activation scores, what's missing is the connection to the remaining part of the network, which is telling us how is the model actually using this information to fulfill a task. Because in the worst case, this part, which we currently are measuring for, this might be pretty much unconnected to the output. So we have information about very representative parts for a completely useless part of the model. We argue a better way to go about this is again use explainability to not only measure the stimulation of this latent part of the model we are interested in, but also measure its utility. And the key difference is here that activations only moves partly through the model in the forward pass, while the explanation spots explanation scores we want to compute rely on the computation of activation scores until the very end of the model. And then we go back again to this interesting bit of the model we want to have a ranking for representative examples for, which tell us, using explanations, how useful is this data point instead of just how stimulating is this for this latent representation. And a motivation of this is a observation we have made numerous times over recent works, and that essentially is that if you look to the bottom right here, that the activation of a hidden neuron in a neural network rarely has anything to do with the relevance score attributed to this neuron during the explanation process, which means just if something activates maximally strong does not mean that this activation is maximally useless for the model, or this data point generating this activation is maximally useless for the model. What's required is that a data point activates on the exactly the correct level to be useless and representative for some latent concept of the model. Maybe one illustrative example is, before I skip this, is that let's say we have some very interesting features x1, x2, represented as filters in the network, which pick up some stuff from latent space transitively over many layers. And we want to know the most representative examples for those two features, x1 and x2. Then we consult our model by basically computing activation scores, and might find that the blue point clouds are the most representative examples for feature x2 and x1 because they activate the strongest. But then after this layer, we have a weight vector which transposes the space into another representation. And we find out that after we have a ReLU activation, which basically drops every activation which is lower than 0, that while those blue clouded points here, those in the blue bubbles, generate the strongest activation scores for x1 and x2, the activations never get fully transported to the next layer. So they are not connected to the network outputs in this case. And while they, based on activation, are selected as most representative examples, they are not selected by explanation scores as most representative examples, which measure the usefulness of data points. Those would rather select the red clouds, for example, which are less strongly expressed in terms of activations, but they are more useful to the model because they activate on a useful level, right? In a nutshell, this means that if you have activation-based selections of reference data, we go by without a task concept. We are not interested in what the model is doing with that. We are just interested in what's stimulating the model in this case. But if you go by relevance or attribution scores in general, we are trying to get samples which are somehow useful to the model. And this leads naturally to complete different sets of example sets. And if you compare the same filters A and B, for example, in this case, and pull up the representative examples for those filters, we see that without a task context, by going with activations, we, for example, see that filter A reacts strongly to images which have white stripes in them, right? But if we ask how is the model using this filter, we get examples which tell us that some lettering is present in the image. So from this bottom part, relevance-based examples, as we understand that the model is using this filter to understand written characters, while from the activation-based one, we only see that it's recognizing lines, but we don't know what it's basically using this this latent decoding for, because context is missing for activations. This is a illustrative example in the image space where we have a bird recognition model again. We have this input to the top left, and in a layer which is basically the first layer directly reading pixel values in input space, we analyze what this model is doing. We find that channel 38 and 55 are of interest. And if you look at the channel outputs, we see that for this particular input image, the strongest activation comes from this leaf here, which is green. So the strongest output pixel is basically concentrated on a green part of the image. And for the channel 55, the strongest reaction we have is something which is green bordering to yellow. If we now try to come up with examples communicating the meaning of those filters based on activations, we have in both cases only a selection of greens, while in the case of relevance-based activation, relevance-based examples procured for those filters, we have green representations for channel 38, and we have yellow examples for channel 55. And why is there a difference? And why is it good that there's a difference? If we want to understand it, we need to look at the actual weights of those channels 38 and 55 and the input normalization input space. So to make it short, the input normalization is constituted by a mean shift. So basically we take the input image, we shift it respectively to the dataset mean by subtracting the mean image and then normalizing the scores. And the image is still represented in RGB color space, which means each pixel has 3 values. They are coordinated as or organized as channels: one green color channel, one red color channel, one green color channel, one blue color channel. And this is also the corresponding order of the filters learned, right? If we take apart the filter of channel 8, for example, 38, for example, we see that it is reading the red channels, which is visible by the negative weights here. It is reading the green channel more strongly, and it's a little bit affected by the blue color channel. So filter channel 55 in this part of the network mostly ignores the red channel, also reads the green channel, but heavily makes use of the blue channel. And the common use of the green channel also explains to us why, in terms of activation-based examples, channel 38 and 55 seem to use the same information, green information, because if we have just examples which are triggering the green channel strongly enough, they will be basically ranked very highly as representatives for both channels if you just concentrate on the green channel. However, if this channel is used to its intended purpose or learned purpose, the model will use it to detect yellow color and basically incorporate this information, and this will be reflected then in the explanation process, and we get, based on relevance, also yellow representation. So we are again in the context of asking, what are you using this thingy for, this filter? We are one step ahead. A nice thing about the relevance-based explanations or example sets we can get based on relevance is that they are contextual again to classes, because while activations only measure how the neuron is stimulated in the forward pass, we can explain the use of a single neuron or filter with respect to several outcomes. For example, you could ask, in general, how is this filter used? And I would get a wide selection of example images. However, I could also ask basically, given this filter of interest, how is it used for recognizing a class thimble or limpkin or chainmail? And then I would get different rankings of samples because they have different importance or meanings or representations of those classes in them. Which means I can get additional perspectives on the use and function of individual neurons, which is also interesting because in literature, there have been mentionings of polysemantic neurons, which means single neurons which are used for different purposes throughout the model. For example, for not only recognizing written letters, but also, I don't know, rungs of ladders or so. So basically you have multiple purposes, and we can disentangle this in this way. Now we talked about getting example images for representing or communicating the meaning of latent encodings. And one typical way to go by is just you take those full neural network input sized images, and then you present them as a ranking, say, yeah, okay, those are the top, what's this, eight top most important images which capture the common concept this neuron has learned. But if you look at this row, I would say for most of us, it would be quite difficult to find the common theme of those examples representing the meaning of this latent concept or latent encoding. We're trying to find the context for or the concept for. We try to understand what this encoding means. So there's a lot going on in those images, and finding the core aspect which is triggering this filter might be a challenging part. So what we can do about this again is, in order to fine tune or to zoom in really into the core aspect of those representations, is again use explainability. And there are two things which are interesting here. For one, if we think about image processing CNNs, their filters, especially for convolutional or only for convolutional layers, are learned to be location invariant, which means the learned filter is basically applied in every possible position over the input image. It measures the same information, which means that since those latent outputs are organized as tensors with a spatial axis, for example, and a channel axis, that concept information is usually organized in the channel order. We can use this information by understanding that in each channel, basically each neuron is measuring the same information. And if this is true, and since in convolutional neural network, a single neuron rarely sees the whole input space, we can use a singular neuron of this channel of interest in order to find out its receptive field by, again, using explanations, which, however, in this case, go by a particular algorithm. We call it the flat rule in the LLP context, which only backpropagates over the connected parts of the network without bothering about the actual activations and weights learned there. So basically, we just move from this particular neuron back to the input space, and everything which is not zero here, or basically everything which is not mapped zero, identifies the receptive field of this neuron. We can use this in order to crop parts of the image then, which are representative to the actual viewport of this filter or in this channel. And the second thing is, if we understand a latent output of the model or a hidden neuron as a detector for something which has been automatically learned by the model, but can be measured because there is a neuron to measure something from, we can also explain it. And we can use both mechanics to, like I said before already, for one, select the part of the image of those representations, which are either most relevant or activating the strongest, and then crop from the input image the receptive field corresponding to the strongest activation. And then we are one step closer to basically to understanding or viewing a summary of this concept, because we are now zooming into the parts of these input images which carry the actual meaning to the filter. Next thing is recognizing that we can basically see this as a detector for this learned something, this mysterious concept. We can explain it and get a heat map-based explanation again in input space, which we can then post-process and threshold, for example, in order to mask out the relevant part. And if we've done all those steps, we arrive at something which allows us to understand that here a regular ring-like or stripe-like structure is whatever the concept is of this particular neuron. Because we can, in this way, get rid a lot of distracting background information, which prevents us from effectively understanding the meaning of this latent encoding. So what we can do now is we can combine both those branches of information. We can now use the disentangled heat map representations corresponding to particular and singular concepts used by the model as presented by a ranking of the most important concepts. And we can, at the same time, provide explanatory examples communicating the meaning of this. And we can basically prevent an explanation in a very expanded manner you see to the left. So we have way more information now than single heat maps would provide. But we can see that the most important piece of information the model has picked up basically, which has a part of 8.8% of the whole decision mass, let's call it like that. So basically this part, or the part channel 469 plate in this layer we are currently looking at, impacted the decision making of the model to 8.8%. Might not look much because 8% might seem absolutely small, but if you think about that, there might be hundreds of encodings for concept in this layer. Suddenly 8.8% is a lot. And we see that the semantics behind this concept, which has been deemed as most influential by the model, are actually lizard eyes and body parts, right? And they are located in a very specific location where the lizard in the input image actually is. The second most concept, however, is green vegetation, which covers almost all the background of the image, also parts of the lizards themselves, and is represented by input space examples from a real data set with a lot of green leaves and foliage, for example. The next one would be the lizard's eyes, which we can understand by looking at those examples again, corresponding to this concept-based heat map. Basically bright rings around a dark center. And then we go on to branches with animals sitting on top or not like structures. And again, it goes on towards basically skin texture concept and so on and so on. So here we only show the top 5 concepts, but there are many more to explore. And I mean, the question is how much information do we need to process as human if presented in this way in order to fully understand the decision-making of the model, especially given that there are potentially hundreds of filters picking up hundreds of concepts in latent space of the model across hundreds of, not hundreds, but tens, or yes, there are models with hundreds of layers. How much stuff do we need to look at in order to understand what's going on? Yeah, I mean, we have more information now. How much more do we need to process? And the answer, fortunately, is not that much, because what we've seen, again, over many iterations of our XAI work is that relevance scores or attribution scores computed as relevance are typically power law distributed, which means there are very few filters which for singular predictions which are very impactful, and the majority of the filters and encodings which are potentially usable by the model stay unused or have no impact. So if you would then accumulate for this particular or over a data set, for example, the relevance scores and see how much would I have to look at in order to capture 95% of the relevance mass. So understand 95% of the grounding of the decision-making of the model, I would arrive at a number of air quotes only 99 filters or concepts I would have to look at. Still a lot, but still considerably fewer than 512 in this case. But we don't want to work through 99 different concepts in order to fully understand what the model is doing. So if I would go about it in another way and see if I would deactivate those concepts, basically suppress it or set the activations to 0 and see how the model would react to them, and then measure the confidence of the model in the class lizard, for example, I would arrive at the number of 20, which means if I would deactivate the 20 most influential filters I discovered in this layer and explained, after the 20th, the model's prediction confidence would drop by about relative 95%. So in order to fully understand what the model is doing in terms of a combination of filters, I would say looking at 20 filters is enough. If you're happy with understanding 85% of what the model is doing, then 30 filters is enough in this case. However, this depends on the layer you're currently investigating, since especially in lower layers, one can assume there's a higher degree of feature reuse, especially if you think about the input layer where the model is picking up something like color gradients and shadings and stuff like that. The color blue might be reused by many different classes, for example, in a classification setting. Okay, and since this was a top-down approach I currently presented, which means we have a prediction and we rank the important latent concepts and then we explain the important latent concepts, we can complement this with a bottom-up analysis. We use the same information, which is accessible to us now, but we can pre-select, for example, regions in input space and ask the model what particular information or filter encodings do you use in order to recognize whatever you recognized in this image. And here we selected, for example, the beak area of this image of a stork and then the lower wingspan of the stork. And we see that in both regions, for example, different concepts are used and recognized, while the beak, for example, is mainly recognized based on color features. The wingspan area is recognized by the model and used for the prediction because we have relevance. We are not dealing with activation. We are using relevance as a measure for utility. We see that here, what's useful for the model to understand the stork is texture-like features, which have a regular nature and cloth foley expression, for example. Yeah, we will use this later in an interesting use case. But the question now is, since we have now richer explanations and more information about what the model is actually doing and recognizing and how it is using this information and combining it, what can we do with it? And one use case would, for example, be validating or invalidating model behavior. And the use case I'm presenting right now is based on the ISIC dataset, which is a skin lesion classification dataset, which has 10 different skin lesion classes. And from previous works, it's, for example, known that this particular dataset has some problems with colorful patches, which are placed by the medical personnel helping with the labeling of this data next to lesions which are associated to non-cancer. Of course, what does the machine learning model do? We train on this data set. It learns the shortcut that if there's something yellow, a bluish, colorish, right, something colorful, which looks like a skin patch, whatever this lesion next to it is, it cannot be cancer. So it learns basically effectively a shortcut. So how can we now use the explanations, the concept-based explanations presented right now, in order to prevent this problem, or at least precisely localize this problem? What we did is, using our methods, we were able to identify the feature encodings responsible for capturing the concept of band-aids, of colorful band-aids. And in order to not only, I mean, this is one first step. We find out which parts of the model encode specific information. The next step would be then we need to verify that this information is actually harmful. And this is what we did. We basically found a bunch of input samples affected by or poisoned by this artifact. And we did two tests, right? Since we knew which parts of the model encode this particular type of feature, we could.
Sebastian,
yes.
Sorry for interrupting. We have just a couple of more minutes, so I would suggest maybe to have like a bit of speed up.
Okay, let's have a bit of speed up. Okay, what you basically can do is we can isolate the parts of the model which encode those apparently malignant features, and then we can test the model's reaction to change, in particular, those features, right? If you, for example, would increase the activation of those latent encodings, and then we can catalog that, if you only change this factor, that in this case, it is highly affecting the non-cancer prediction, which means the model is actually affected in this way to predict that someone is cancer-free if there's a colorful patch in there. And this is basically extremely risky if you would deploy this model in a real medical setting, for example, in a hospital. This is not the only problem we found with our methods on the dataset. Other problems, for example, are that the model has learned to associate felt tip markings and how do you say, rulers on the dermatoscopes with the occurrence of class cancer, which clearly reflects that the model is using in its top 5 features. They are in this particular example, they are all concentrated on the felt tip area. They express felt tip-like colors, or they express black lines like we see in this this ruler, basically on the dermatoscope, which means that if someone is or someone's skin is basically screened by a dermatologist in an AI-based way, which has a tiny ruler on the lens, the predicted risk of someone having cancer, even if the person doesn't have cancer, is quite high. So this might also give pointers to for fixing data sets and so on. Another interesting use case is, given that we can identify encodings of features, for example, in this case, we have the prediction of a safe class, also the class safe or lockbox on an image in the dataset. The image has been predicted correctly, but we find in the explanations given by our methods that there might be some suspicious horizontal band in the image of the in the center of the image, which we find interesting. So, right, using our bottom-up approach, which allows us to select and investigate an area of the explanation and image, we see that the features used in this case or in this area are all associated to the recognition of lettering. And if you now again do the test of whether this has an impact of changing the outcome by deactivating those filters, this is not the case here. So it means basically there's enough evidence in the image as a whole to safely identify the safe or lockbox class. We can still ask a question: if we have found an encoding which is responsible to identify written characters or lettering in the image, is it the only class affected by it, or are there other classes affected? And we can use this information, for example, by picking a filter 361 and then create a ranking over all other data points available to us or other classes used by the model, which attribute high usage or express high usage in terms of relevance attributed to this filter. And then we can find out, for example, there are different classes actually making heavy use of this filter. For example, the classes Whistle, Morp, Screw, Mosquito Net, and Can Opener, but also Puma and Spiderweb. And if I would then derive explanations again, I would see that those barely visible copyright tags, again, those images are picked up by this particular filter and are used by those classes, while in other cases, for Puma and Spiderweb, the filter is being used to recognize the Puma's whiskers or the Spiderweb, again, where we are at the point of polysemanticity, for example, for filters. One filter serving in a grander scheme of prediction making of the model different purposes. And now we could fix the model, for example, by suppress this filter or strip it away or prune it away from the model. However, given the ranking we obtained with the Puma and Spiderweb classes being in there, we know that we might not only fix problems for 5 classes, we might also hurt the model for predicting other classes. We might have to develop different strategies for basically tackling this problem either in model space or in data space. As an outlook to future work, we now have much richer representations of model behavior in terms of example-based, concept-based explanations. And the question now is it actually useful? Teaser, yes, it's incredibly much more useful for untrained end users in order to recognize that the model is using or not using particular decision-making strategies. In terms of efficiency, there are 2 phases when it comes to computing those example-based explanations. There's a pre-processing phase, which takes a model and a data set from which we can or need to create a lookup table, so to speak, for each neuron in the model, which examples are so associated with it. It takes about 20 minutes on consumer-grade hardware, which means workstation in the GPU. And in order to come up with those concept-based, example-based explanations and the heat maps I've shown you, this takes just an order of second because our approach is based on backpropagation procedures. So it's highly efficient and it's near real time. And an outlook to future work also, we have seen or we have shown in the paper that the information provided by our methods allows us to have a glimpse into substructures or interactions between filters learned by the model by finding, for example, highly similarly behaving filter sets in the model's latent representations, which seem to do the same thing based on the activation scores, however, which are can be associated to basically making micro decisions in later space by the model, for example, distinguishing between, for one, recognizing different types of buttons, but also distinguishing between those particular types of buttons in order to distinguish, for example, between laptops and TV remote controls. Other noteworthy mentions and projects I wanted to highlight, basically all going into this, the work of the explainability group at Fraunhofer HHI are different software frameworks, works on canonization for neural networks. Thanks European Union for funding parts of the stuff I've talked about right now. Also very interesting is the Quantus project, which is concerned with not only providing nice to look at and good to visualize heat map based representations, but also to provide measurable evidence of the quality of explanations in different aspects. And that has been it. Thanks for your time. Questions are open.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sebastian. We have already a few questions in the chat. So one question targets like the challenges of data privacy. Can they be addressed by XAI, or especially like in this new approach, is data privacy an issue? Or is
I mean, yes, data privacy might be an issue, but there's a way around it actually. So maybe let's look at this slide. This one, right? So I think the most sensitive parts or the most potentially privacy violating parts are the explanation, or the parts of the explanations providing examples, because especially in a medical setting, you do not want to present some sensitive patient data as examples for learned concepts. However, what you can do in this case is you could, for example, replace this process of selecting or processing real data for coming up with explanations for learned concepts with, again, synthetic data or using open access data sources, given the assumption that the part of the model, this latent filter you're currently looking for the most representative examples for, is a static function which provides the same function regardless of data source you put in. So if you don't have access to, so the point is just use non-usable data, right? You can use synthetic data in order to get examples. There are different ways to get around that. We have examples in the paper.
Another question, since we can kind of identify filters which are good for selected parts of the image, could you select which filters to use for the prediction based on this information?
Yes, you can.
So
yeah, this is
like a two-phase of.
Yeah, this is ongoing work in our group basically. And the idea is, or one idea is that, for example, let's say we know that one particular class has developed, or the model has developed problems associated to one particular class, for example, that we know that it's predicting horses partly because horses are jumping over hurdles, right? We can identify this behavior, and then we can, in our evaluation process of the model, have a first prediction, which tells us the model thinks in this image there's a horse. And then we can react to that by saying, okay, we have encodings for hurdles the horses are jumping over. We need to suppress them in order to make sure that there's actually a horse in the image. And then, given that those are filters are suppressed, we can predict the same image again with partially suppressed features and see if the outcome is still the same. Then we know that the horse would be predicted based on non-hurdle features at least. Or if the prediction changes significantly, we at least know at this stage already that the prediction is highly influenced by some features we do not want to use or want the model to use. And this would be one of the adapt strategies I teased earlier, basically, where we can have an understanding and reacting to this information provided by explanation.
So one last question regarding correction of AI systems. How can we arrive at more trustworthy AI systems? So if we know that something is going on, how can we get rid of the bias? Or
so we have some works in this direction. One way would be this adaptive approach I just explained. We have a paper from this year where we introduced a method called class artifact compensation, which uses for one explanations in order to find systematic strategies learned by the model if those strategies are, for example, deemed as non-benign by us, so they shouldn't be used. We can either do two things in this work alone, right? There's actually a lot of things we can do, but what we do is, in this case, we want to address the problem on a model level, because what you always can do is you can react to the explanations and then fix your data sets essentially. But this might be a costly process because you have a lot of samples potentially which have problems, but still a lot of good information the model should use. So what the Clark approach does is it looks for encodings in the model which express difficult behavior, and then is able to take countermeasures to either suppress this information globally for the whole model, which lead to other problems maybe, or we can devise counter strategies which allows the model to unlearn specific behavior in consecutive fine-tuning steps. For example, let's say all the horse images we have horses, but all the horse images we have also have the same copyright tag in the bottom left corner. And what the model would learn is it would associate probably the copyright tag with the class horse because it's an easier, more static feature. We cannot just get rid of all the horse images then, because our dataset would be devoid of any horse examples. So we want to use those horse examples we have. We can extend the dataset, but we can also attack the encodings of horse features by modeling an expression of this feature in latent space and just randomly adding it to other classes examples to devalue this feature to the model and force the model to adapt to other features to use for recognizing horses. So there are definitely ways to improve machine learning models based on explainability information. There's a lot of work going on using explanations with expected explanations as part of the loss function. So there's definitely people working on that.
Okay, good. So thank you very much, Sebastian, for this interesting talk, and also thanks to the audience for the good questions. And yeah, see you again.
See you, Ryan. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learned something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak. After the networking session, we invite you to explore the lobby. Try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the e-shop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for Good.